Thank you for joining us today for the ABCs of Behavior with Yiliana Puerto.
Hi, thank you, Caesar, and thank you for having me today. We will be discussing the ABCs of behavior. So what is applied behavior analysis? So we know that applied behavior analysis is the process of systematically applying interventions based upon the principles of learning theory. Now, we use these principles in order to improve socially significant behaviors to a meaningful degree for the individuals and the students that we service, in order to demonstrate that these interventions that are responsible for this improvement in behavior. Now, in applied behavior analysis, we look and utilize 7 dimensions of ABA. Generalization is one of those dimensions, and this essentially means that skills are taught in one environment that will maintain over time and over people across different environments. So that is one of the very important dimensions of ABA. It is also effective in that interventions are monitored in order to evaluate the impact of the target behavior and to evaluate if that target behavior has had enough change to produce meaningful improvements for the individual being serviced. Technological is also that procedures are described clearly and concisely so that others may be able to implement the same strategy or the same intervention accurately. Applied is also one of those dimensions, and that means that there are socially significant behaviors that are selected. And so targets are identified that are important to everyday life and to the client and family receiving ABA services. The next dimension is that it is conceptually systematic, and that means that interventions are consistent with these principles as demonstrated in the literature, and they utilize principles of behavior and learning in their descriptions. We also have analytic, which is very important dimension, which utilizes efforts that show that interventions are effective and reliable, such as through data-based decision-making and experimental design. And lastly, but not least, is behavior. We need to make sure that behavior is observable and measurable. And when we identify the target behaviors that we will be selecting and working on. So we want to make sure that it is clear, concise, observable, and measurable. So let's go into what ABCs stands for behavior and the ABCs of behavior. So A stands for antecedent, B stands for behavior, and C stands for consequence. And we will dive into each one of these. So antecedent is what happens immediately before a specific behavior. This can include things like a particular setting, specific people around, certain objects around, events that might take place, and truly so much more is going on around us at all times than sometimes we are aware of. And so we want to make sure that the antecedent is attending to that specific behavior, to that specific stimuli, excuse me, that is occurring before the behavior identified. Now, an antecedent may include something that is added or presented, such as a demand, a task, or a prompt. An antecedent may include something being removed, such as being told no, a preferred item being taken away, some kind of transition, or the losing of an item. Now, antecedents can also be situational. So being left alone, for example, or having no attention from caregivers, or maybe having too much attention from peers, being in a noisy environment, being in a cold environment or a hot environment. There are different setting events that can also be situational that can be antecedents to specific behaviors. So let's look at an example that specifies antecedents. So Mr. Johnson's class was loud and unruly, and the students could not hear him asking them to lower their voices. He turned the lights on and off, and the students all stopped talking and directed their attention to Mr. Johnson. So the student's behavior in this case is that they stopped talking and they directed their attention to Mr. Johnson. So if we look at this scenario, we ask, what is the antecedent? So what is the antecedent that preceded the specific behavior of the reduction in talking? And we know that it is that flickering of the lights on and off. So that specific stimuli was proceeding and provoked the behavior of the discontinuing of the talking and the redirecting of their attention to Mr. Johnson. Now, behavior is what the individual says or does. Again, behavior must be specific, it must be observable, and it must be measurable. What we mean by that is we want to make sure that the definitions that we are using when we are looking at a particular behavior are clear, they are concise, and they are objective so that more than one observer can collect data on the same specific behavior. Now let's look at an example that specifies and focuses on behavior. So Mrs. Perez is completing assessments with students in her class. She is showing them pictures of different animals and they need to label each one. So she shows one of her students a picture of a bear and she asks, "What animal do you see?" And the student replies, "That's a giraffe." So Mrs. Perez marked this trial incorrect. Now, based on the scenario provided, can we identify the student's behavior? And if you guessed the verbal behavior of labeling a giraffe, a bear that is a giraffe, or a giraffe that is a bear, that is correct. So the picture was of a bear, and while it was an incorrect label, and the student identified the bear as a giraffe, that itself is the specific behavior that we are looking for, which is the verbal behavior of the student identifying the picture of the animal provided. And C in the ABCs of behavior stands for consequence. So consequence is what happens immediately after the behavior occurs. So consequences can be both positive, such as something being added, or negative, which means something is being removed. It can take the form of a reprimand, it can be praise, or it can take different forms of consequences. Now, sometimes nothing happens after a behavior, excuse me, and that is quite okay too. So when we look at positive consequences, we want to make sure that we are attending to something that was added after the behavior took place. And if we're looking and focusing on a negative consequence, we're looking at something being removed after a specific behavior. Now, the consequence example that we have today is that we're going to look at Billy and a television show that he likes to watch. So after Billy drops to the floor, kicking and screaming, Dad immediately apologizes and puts the original show back on. So Billy stopped kicking and screaming and he sits back down on his sofa to enjoy the rest of his show. So if we look at the scenario, we ask, well, what happened here? What does Billy learn about kicking and screaming? What could Dad have done differently? And so we see that Billy dropped to the floor and he engaged in kicking and screaming, which is the behavior. And Dad's consequence to that behavior is that he immediately apologizes and basically gave access back to Billy in order for him to watch his favorite show. Now, if we take back and we look back at the antecedent to Billy's behaviors, we know that the changing of that channel, right, was what initially provoked the Billy dropping to the floor and engaging in the kicking and screaming behaviors. Now, one thing that we can work with Dad on is identifying what ways we can teach Billy to get access to his show if he wants access to his show or if he needs to watch something in particular. And in this case, we can work with Dad to teach Billy how to request appropriately using whether it's words or signs or pointing some kind of some kind of communicative response that indicates that he wants his show returned rather than engaging in dropping to the floor and kicking and screaming to get the same consequence. So if we take a look and we think back to Mrs. Perez and her student, Mrs. Perez was again completing assessments for some of the students in her class. She was showing them pictures of different animals and they were needing to label these animals. She shows one of her students a picture of a bear and asks, "What animal do you see?" And again, the student replied, "That's a giraffe," right? So Mrs. Perez marked the trial incorrect. Well, if we want to take a look at that same scenario, we can identify what the consequence here was. And so if you take a guess at the consequence of the student verbally identifying the response or the animal incorrectly, that is the correct response to this and the correct answer to this scenario. Now, Mrs. Perez also marked that trial incorrect because again, the picture of a bear is not the same as the identification of giraffe for that animal. So we need to make sure that we ask things like, did any learning take place in this scenario? So what we would hope to do is work with Mrs. Perez so that if this trial is incorrect for this student, the next time that she represents this question of what animal do you see with a picture of a bear, she is ready to provide the prompting to the student so that the student can correctly identify a bear being a bear and reduce the incorrect identifying of a bear being a giraffe. So we want to make sure that we are looking at socially significant behaviors and that learning is taking place even after incorrect trials. And I open up the floor to questions and answers at this time. Any questions?